Welcome. My name is Charlene Garrett, and this is the Accidental Mentor podcast, where we talk about mentoring that can be intentional, but oftentimes is accidental. This is episode 4 of a 5-hour conversation. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you can stay up to date with our episodes as they come out. In the last episode, we talked about a lot of things in Julie's life, but something that really jumped out was this tension that I had of when to help and when to solve problems and when to really just encourage and hands off, let her solve her own problems. In this next episode, we're going to talk about inner healing, and Julie really goes into detail about how that impacted her life, this retreat that we had in our church called The Encounter, and incremental growth, a little bit of fruit and maybe a little bit of fallback. So listen in. Here's today's episode on the Accidental Mentor.
It's really hard now to even think back because I know it was this person that we're talking about. I fully know that, but I can't remember it in my memories. It's like a story told about someone else.
We tell stories. So I retell your story, and I will mention, hey, the night before I probably make it way more dramatic. The night before she's about to be evicted, she gets in her car and takes off to Dallas, and it takes a 4-hour drive, took 12 hours. And there was, to be fairness, this is pre how we use GPS and all those things, but maps. But you get there, you get to your grandma's house, and I remember you telling me she didn't know what to do, so she made you a turkey sandwich. And so you and then things begin to change. Mm. I don't know how long it was before you called me or before we talked next, but I remember talking to you, and you sounded lighter, like you had started making some different decisions. And I'd heard this before. You've made, as you mentioned, it wasn't 10 or 12 years or whatever of total suck. There were some really good choices that you made in there and really good things. And then, so it was like all of our lives. It was kind of hills and valleys, but it sounded different. And I was just kind of waiting. I was like, okay, great. And just waiting for the next conversation. How did you get from your grandmother's house to the next phase? Because I remember you got a job again at a place that you'd worked. I think, had you worked there before? I don't remember what happened. What happened next?
So
because I'm now curious.
Next, I was at my grandmother's. So the first thing I did was I found a church. And I was like, Charlene, I think that's when we first talked. And I said, Charlene, I need to go to church. So where do I go?
Talked. I said, go back.
Right? Yeah, you told me to go back, I guess, to the people that were in the church that we went to in Grapevine, and we're now another church, Open Door. And so I went there.
Another church.
Yeah. So I went to that service and everything. I was like, oh, this is it. Doing stuff. This is so proud of me. And I get there. It was they had a luncheon, a monthly luncheon down in the cafeteria. And I go down there. I'm like, I'm all in. I'm doing this. Nobody talked to me. I mean, people said hello to me, but no one, because I knew people and there were people that remembered me, but I had no connection. Right. And so all the people had their own families and their own connections. And I was kind of like, okay, well, I'm going to go back until they do talk to me. So I went back, and I have friendships that are now lifelong too from me going back, even though I was uncomfortable in the first time, right? Because no one's intention was to, we're not going to talk to Julie.
Yeah.
Clearly that's a bad decision. But when I went back, when was it? I just knew, I was like, okay, Lord, I'm supposed to have a job. Grown up people who graduated college should have a job. And I have no idea where to get one. I mean, I put out resume after resume when I was in Houston, same thing in Florida, nothing. But so I felt the Lord tell me, he's like, hey, go talk to Donna. I just went up to Donna at church because I knew she was kind of a life coach, and she helped people and she had it all together. So she was another person I thought had it all together. And the Lord told me I needed to talk to her. So I just went up, active obedience, and said, hey, Donna, I'd like to pick your brain. Do you think we could have lunch sometime? Which I've never would have done that before. And she goes, absolutely. She goes, do you need a job? And I was like, I do need a job. And she goes, send me your resume. And so I sent her my resume that Sunday, and I got a call from the agency on Wednesday, an interview at the auto finance company on Friday. And I got that job as a contractor, and I'm still there. So I've been there for almost 10 years. And it's been amazing, but I didn't have to apply for anything, which was crazy because I had worked so hard applying for stuff and knocking on all the doors, with to the best of my ability at the time, and nothing happened. There was no result. I didn't know how I would find a job, and God just had the perfect one. I had zero effort put out.
And you temped for about a year, and then they hired you on? Is that how it was?
I did that for roughly a little bit over a year, and then I got hired on full time.
Yeah, that's awesome. Now, you went and you lived with someone that you had worked for before. Is that...
Yes.
Where was the next place that you lived in Dallas?
So that was in
your grandmother's.
In Fort Worth. So my grandmother was in Dallas, and so I kind of been going in between her house and my old boss's house. So I worked in a retail store, years prior when I lived in Texas, and she was my boss at the time. And so she's one of those longtime life friends that you don't necessarily see all the time, but is forever your friend. And so I called her and went to her house, and I was kind of back and forth between her and my grandmother, just staying because she had just had a baby. So I got to visit a lot, and that was wonderful. And then when I started my job, it was closer to her house. And so she let me, I think that's when I actually unpacked the minivan. And Toyota Siennas, y'all are awesome. That minivan really saved me. My mom gifted me that right before I left because I didn't have a car. So my mom did gift me a minivan. So everything I was able to keep was in that minivan. And when I kind of landed at Kinder's house to start my job, I finally unpacked. But for the months prior to that, I had places to stay, but ultimately I was homeless because I didn't have a residence. And I stayed with her when my job started.
Julie, it's so funny. It's so good. I want to come back to that, but you just mentioned a car, and it reminded me of all of our car stories of the 3 years that we were in Texas together. There was several car situations.
Oh yeah, I've had probably 30 cars.
30 cars. I've had 30 jobs. You've had 30 cars. You had a car accident. I remember that was pretty traumatic.
Oh, when I got hit by the 18-wheeler.
In Fort Worth, maybe. Yes.
Yeah, that was traumatic. It hit me, and then I spun.
Your little white car?
Yeah. No, that was a Honda that I had bought
was it
from.
White?
Yes, it was white. That was accurate. And so, yeah, the Honda hit the 18-wheeler hit me. I spun across the highway, and really, I was okay. I think I probably used it for dramatic purposes back then. Everything was a much bigger deal to me. But ultimately I was okay in that, but I think it was not too long after that you were like, have you thought of getting a different car? Because at the time, this is when I was working at the store, that Kinder and I met at, and I had, a little extra income, and you were like, you should get a car. And I was like, I don't think that's going to be a thing. Because I didn't have good credit or anything like that. And you took me to CarMax, and I got the Kia Rio Cinco. They said yes. I was very shocked.
This is also a key. It's funny. We only do the things that we know. So I also had a lot of different car situations in my life. One of which was while I lived in Texas, I bought for cash. Like I had a car prior that was too expensive. Like I had a note on it that I owned, but it was in my parents' name. And I realized I shouldn't have this car. It's too expensive. It still is more payment now than I ever would pay for a car. And so I gave it back to my parents and let them deal with the fact that they had put their name on something that we shouldn't have gotten. And I had about $1,500, and I bought a car for cash. Do you remember this story? You're laughing.
The Mazda?
I bought this car. I was so proud of it. And
oh,
it was a Mazda. It was a Mazda.
It
wasn't the 626. It was a Protege.
It was the paint one though, right?
Yeah. So I got it painted because the Mako did a closed door special on painting. And so I hadn't yet gotten the title switched over because I still had my 4Runner or my Pathfinder. And so I took it, I got it painted. It was red. I painted it a midnight blue with the door shut. So when you open the door jamb was red. I couldn't believe I did that. But anyway, so I get it painted. And then within a week or two, I finally tell my boss I'm going to come in late. I commuted to Dallas for work, and I take the car and the title to the DMV or whatever, the licensing place. And they're like, oh, I'm sorry, we can't transfer this title to you. And I'm like, I'm sorry, why? It's been reported stolen I was in Tarrant County, in Dallas County. And I was like, what do I do? They're like, you need to surrender this to the cops. I was like, I need to do what? Conveniently, the police station was right next to the bail bonds where the church was. So I went by the church and I noticed that the receptionists were there. And I was like, hey, can you give me a ride home? Why? Because I'm about to give my car to the police. Gave my car up. They impounded it. A few weeks later, I got it back after paying $500 for it. Anyway, long story short, I ended up trading that in at CarMax because I needed a car and I didn't have enough money. So I was going to have to get a loan again. And I didn't have good enough credit. So my dad had to co-sign. So my dad co-signed for me at CarMax then to get this car. And I remember feeling defeated because I didn't want a payment at all. I made plenty of money to pay the payment and could have had a higher payment actually. But so I got a 626. And when I got the car, the guy, they traded in my little car and they gave me $500 for it. And he goes, did you know that this car has a salvage title? I'm like, uh-huh. He said, did you know that it's been painted? I was like, really? It has? I didn't say I did it. I just was like, oh.
Oh, God.
A live omission. I was just like, just get rid of this car. I'm so done. But I do remember sitting with you at CarMax, but I think we also went to Kia. We went to like a legit place because they had like some advertisement. And I remember them telling us no.
CarMax is legit. They gave
before we ever went to CarMax. Well, they are
They're more legit now than they
but
were
like,
back then.
I mean, in my mind, the first place you go to, yeah, and the first place you go is like a car dealership that only has one kind of car. I think it was newish. CarMax was newish, this idea. Now it's like Carvana is the you're going to buy a car on a tower. I don't understand. But yeah, I just remember, and they gave you I didn't co-sign. I know that. So
no,
they must have, they just gave it to you, right?
They just gave it to me. Because I think at that point,
they were able
I didn't
to
have
necessarily
bad credit. I just didn't have a lot of credit. I didn't have any, I think, at that point. I don't know that I'd actually gotten a credit card where I made a poor choice with. I just think I didn't have any. So yeah, I got my first car there. I remember you asking me, like, what do you want in a car? Like, what are your things? And I was like, I just want it to be the same color as itself, which is funnier now that I know your paint story, because I just meant when I was younger, my dad had his Ford truck. I think it was a Ford. No, I don't know what brand it was, but he had this truck and it was white with a red camper top. And then he dented the front end. And my dad was a shade tree mechanic and he went and got a blue replacement piece that he was eventually going to paint, but he didn't. And so it was always like a red, white, and blue truck. And I was like, Lord, I just want to color the same color as the car, the same color as itself. Excuse me. And the thought of actually getting a car at this point, I think that was probably my like 7th or 8th car. I had so many cars. I probably had 50 now that I think about it. A lot of cars, but yes, you got me that car. To me, you did that. Like you knew everything. You knew the process. I think you probably mentioned you had just done it, but I didn't know it was a new process for you. I just felt like you knew that. And so, yeah, we're going to go get a car. I should have kept that car. It was a great car.
I mean, the process that I knew was what my dad had helped me with, right? So like we learned something from somebody else and we use that for the next thing and until we learn something else. Right. And oftentimes we learn by failure, by making mistakes like, ooh, that's not a good idea. You know, I wouldn't recommend doing that again. That didn't work out. Right. So that's a part of mentoring. I mean, it literally is just life on life. And I think again, I didn't know everything about cars. I just knew a little bit more about how to get a car than you did. And we had to rely on the people at the dealership and ask questions and use discernment because, you know, they're always trying to sell you and, okay, what do we do? And is this a good thing? And we probably got somebody to check out the Rio. I don't remember if we did or not, but that was, you know, I definitely at that point was not going to recommend that we buy it from an individual because I had just bought a stolen vehicle without knowing it. I mean, the first thing that the cop said to me when I turned in my car was, when you bought this, did you ask to see his driver's license, like to compare it to the title? And I was like, no, why would I do that? He had the title. Like, I didn't think to do that. But never again would I buy a car from somebody without being like, hey, can I check your driver's license compared to your title? I know it's weird, but I've bought a stolen vehicle before, so I'm not going to do that again. Like, which I did that later on in my life. So, and they were like, the guy was like, you want to do what? I'm like, I know it's a little bit a lot, but humor me,
Yeah.
And he was like, okay. And he owned the car. So I didn't buy another stolen vehicle. So there you go. Oh my goodness. All these things. It's so fun to reminisce. You mentioned when you started making good choices and things changed, that you started to implement things that you learned in the encounter. I think we need to go back and explain what that is. You didn't have like some angel drop down and encounter, like the encounter.
Oh gosh, no, I was terrified
So
of that.
I'll start and then you can fill in the dots. But back at the church where we met, basically where I was going, we did this thing called Encounter that was a weekend retreat, and it was healing life's hurt. So it talked a lot about forgiveness and decisions that we had made, and like your past, things that maybe had been done to you, or childhood, and talked about the Father Heart of God and things like, we say ungodly beliefs or beliefs about ourselves that God doesn't believe about us, that aren't biblical. Vows that we may have made, judgment. What is judgment? So like all these kind of laws. So you spend a weekend with that. And I remember the first time, I do remember this. I remember being like, okay, Julie, an encounter's coming up. I'd love to sponsor you. We did this sponsorship model, and we were going to go through Encounter. And I remember you not liking the term. You're like, can we call it something else?
That sounds terrifying. Scary. It sounded like intervention. Like I didn't understand encountering God at all. I had no reference for that. So I was like, oh, so this is a weekend where we get to go and sit around and I tell church people about all my mistakes. That sounds like an encounter. I mean, like an intervention versus an encounter. And so I was like, let's just call it a donut. Donuts aren't scary. So let's just call it that. Because the word itself was terrifying. It was like an event where we, bring up all my shortcomings and sin. It sounded horrible.
All my stuff?
Yeah, all my stuff. What? Yeah, it sounded horrible.
Well, and I remember that first time, for whatever reason, you weren't able to be there the whole time. I remember talking you through it in the car for some reason, like going through part of it in the car.
No, we did it. We did part of it in the car. It wasn't me. You had to pick somebody up from the airport. So we were on this second day.
It was me.
And you had to pick somebody up. So we did it on the car. We did on the drive to the airport, I think, to pick I don't remember who the person was.
Okay.
But we were finishing. And you're like, okay, we can finish. And we did that in the car.
Okay, in the car. Mm-hmm. Do you remember that first encounter? What are some memories that you have of that?
See, the first one is pretty foggy for me. I don't,
because you did it again later.
Clearly. I did it again later. So a year or two later, I went through it again with Pat, who I didn't know who you were living with. I don't know if you were living with her at the time. I think you were. And so she was my sponsor. I did not know her. And I was living with a guy at the time. We were engaged. And so I'm not living clearly in a biblical manner at all. And she was like, well, we were talking about the things that the Lord wants. And she was like, and certain things, I was like, well, I don't necessarily want to do that. And she was like, okay. And there was like no judgment in her tone. And she's like, okay. She's like, well, do you want it? And I was like, I want to want it. And she goes, will you be open to praying that? And I was like, I could pray that. And that was one of the most life-changing prayers I've ever prayed, because I didn't want it. I didn't want to stop doing the things that gave me comfort to be obedient to Christ, because I didn't know the benefit for me. It felt completely terrifying. And so I was like, okay, I'll pray to want it. And then, as gradually my heart changed and I began to want it more until I wanted it.
I'm so proud of Pat for meeting you where you were. I think, again, remembering that, like, one of the mistakes that I've made in my life early on, especially, and I've remembered this, is essentially pushing people to do something to my ideal, like what I think needs to happen. Or, one of the reasons why I became a coach is I began to learn that people say they want you to tell them what to do, but people are really going to do what they want to do. Like you have to have the revelation. I have to decide what I want to do. You can tell me all day long and it can be the right, good, whatever thing. But if I don't want it, it's not helpful. And so I'm so happy that she was able to say, and it's not just drop it, but just say, well, do you want to pray to want it? Is that something you could do? And that you were like, I would want to. I don't want to right now, but yeah, let's see if God can do that. Let's double dog dare him to see if can he change my want? Yeah. I don't even know. Let's see. And, and he did.
He did
over time.
And then eventually Pat and I would teach the encounter together. So that was kind of interesting.
So that's a cool thing. So you came back. So let's run the thread through again with the encounter. So the thing that I remember, I'm living in Tennessee. I'd lived in Africa. I'm back in Tennessee. I'm back in the States. I'm living in Tennessee. You moved from Houston to Dallas. I'm listening to you. And I remember being in my kitchen cooking. I was doing the Whole30, so really complicated cooking. So I remember being complicated about making dinner. And you called either before or during, or maybe right after, I can't remember, right when you had done the encounter this time. So now this is like your third maybe time, but you were back at the church, Open Doors still doing encounters, and you called to tell me about it. And I remember hearing so much fruit, like it sounded like it was the first time you had been, like it was like all these connections for you. Do you remember that time that you did the encounter? Can you tell us about that?
I do, because it was very different as I was approaching it more, clear-minded, but also open to actually do the work, to do the things and give things to the Lord. Before, I didn't have any kind of trust for the Lord at all. So my trust in the encounter was strictly, I gave it to you. I mean, I borrowed your trust for those. And this was the first one I actually went through and really invested and did the things and gave the things to the Lord that he wanted me to do. So it was very, very different. Like right after that, I think I started teaching, which was also weird because I was like, there's no way somebody who talks as fast as I do should be up in front of a room of people. They're not going to be able to keep up. But God is good. And I got way better at that over time.
You taught ungodly beliefs, right?
I did. Yep, ungodly beliefs, because that was really the core of what was wrong with me is I believed things that were a lie. And then I would set up patterning where I expected the negative thing to happen. And so I would react in a way that it would happen. So I'd hang out with the people that would make me feel the way that other people had. And I would do the same things and I'd get the same result. And so one of the things that the encounter taught me was not to partner with those thoughts. If it's not what God said, it's a lie. And so to retrain your brain, sometimes you have to walk out in faith and just say, you know what, that's not true. I'm going to expect different this time. And then, like I said, I practiced being thankful. But it was just so different when I actually believed it, like you were talking about earlier. I had to believe it for myself. So I learned all the things and went through the encounter several times.
Yeah.
And I think I got there was a little fruit there. It wasn't like I walked away completely unchanged in those moments, but I hadn't actually realized it for myself. So that was what was, I think, so different. Because after that, I think I went on and I just taught it and went to so many more encounters.
I know. I will say, I'm going to put a plug in here for this. One of the things that I did early on when I was in Texas with the encounter, because we had this sponsorship model, I constantly was sponsoring somebody. I didn't teach for a long time, but AJ Jones had first brought us some of this information from Toronto Airport Christian Fellowship, which was now it's Catch the Fire, years and years ago. And we had modified it and changed it and all that kind of stuff in Texas and added some things. But what I remember was every time that I was sponsoring somebody, I also learned and I grew a little bit, like while I'm helping somebody. So I continued to listen and engage. And I refuse to allow myself to think of it as an event. Like, okay, this is one and done. Like the encounter, I did the encounter, check. Like I kept going back and back and back. So when I went off to Africa, came back, and I ended up in Tennessee, the church that I landed at had their version of the encounter at that point. And it wasn't too long until I started teaching here, the encounter. And one of our struggles with people was that they would check it off. It's like, oh yeah, encounter, I've done that. And what we were constantly trying to help people realize is it's a lifestyle. And it still is. Like forgiveness is a lifestyle. Thankfulness is a lifestyle. At any point, I can choose not to do it. Like I can choose to eat healthy or not eat healthy. It's a lifestyle choice. And, but whatever I sow, I reap. And so if I keep sowing into these things, then I'm going to reap them. And so it's so fun to hear all of the connections of that for you. And that, there is fruit, but we can't live off just that little bit of fruit forever, right? There's got to be something new. Even as we grow, like now you're in a totally different phase of growth with God. I remember you talking about your current church and really digging into the word in a different aspect now, right? And so super important to keep growing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anything else you want to say about the encounter?
The encounter, like I just agree with you. I think that was the part, like you were saying, I had to get it for myself. And then that requires people letting you get it for yourself. I think sometimes when we're trying to help someone, we get caught up in the, I want them to be better. And so I want to kind of urge them to do things. Sometimes people can get a little bit too involved in someone else's freedom that they take it personal. And I think that was something that you did well, was to not take it personal and know that that was true. That what you taught at the encounter was truth. And I could trust the Lord with my stuff, or I didn't have to. And when I really started doing it and practicing it every day, that's where I saw change. So it wasn't, to some elements, yes, it was a complete miracle. God healed me, freed me from drug addiction, all my medication, anxiety on August 19th, 2012, or 2013, sorry. But at the same time, the tools that I learned through the encounter is what, like walking it out, being sanctified and changing my behaviors to be in line and be obedient to what the word says. And the result is I have the freedom. Like I said, I don't have anxiety or depression or anything like that anymore. I have an amazing job, and I get to teach my team kind of the same things. I was actually talking to one of my team members the other day about mentorship and mentoring, because a lot of my people are getting connected for the first time in that type of relationship. And I think people get scared of it because it sounds like, oh, they're just going to give me a bunch of assignments, or they're going to expect me to do so much. And I think when mentorship is done well, it really is the mentee that gets to kind of drive it. And even though I needed way more, so our friendship was very unbalanced back, in the beginning, it was still balanced for what I had to give. And I think that it's important to let people walk things out the way that they need to, because they can't do it the way I did. I can't be like, well, if you just quit everything and drive to Dallas, it's going to be fine. Just get your grandma to make you a sandwich and it'll all turn out well. I can't promise them that, but I can tell them the truth. And so, like I said, I was encouraging my employees to just, it's not that scary. It really isn't. I mean, it's just regular people. I have mentors at work and my boss. And, if you look at people for a while, you'll think, like I did you, she has it all together and there's, never struggles with anything, but you just knew a little bit more than I did at the time. And you let me borrow that. And that's really all that the relationship is. I mean, it's not that complicated. It's just friendship. A little bit of
Wow, that was fun. To talk more about our experience with the encounter and inner healing. The thing that jumped out that Julie mentioned was ungodly beliefs. An ungodly belief, as you heard her say, is something that we believe about ourselves that God doesn't believe about us. They limit us. You can often refer to them as self-limiting beliefs. And Julie, it really changed Julie's life to the point where she was teaching on it and helping others get freedom with this concept of ungodly beliefs. I'm curious, take a moment, pause, pray, ask God, do you have any beliefs, anything that you're believing about yourself that isn't true, that's holding you back? He can take that away. He can replace that with the truth. I would love to hear about it. If you're brave, comment. If you want to email me, contact me. All of my information is there in the show notes, all of my social media contact information. I really want to hear from you. In this next episode, we talk more about what it's like to put people on pedestals when they fall off of those pedestals. We talk about fear, anxiety. There's a lot of topics in this episode. You're going to want to really remember that. Be sure to like, subscribe, review. We really appreciate you listening to this, and I'm excited to really continue to engage. Remember that he who began a good work in you will carry it out to completion. My name is Charlene Garrett, and this is The Accidental Mentor.